the lords of the north brought chests of crushed velvet, heavy silver, and hammered gold. Their daughters knelt smelling of rosewater and quiet desperation, offering their soft necks to the wolf who wore the crown. King Conrad stared at the fortune piled at his muddy boots and felt nothing but the dull, creeping urge to tear out throats. Then she walked up. No silk, no jewels, just a crumpled, yellowed piece of parchment. A clumsy charcoal sketch of a boy holding a wooden sword. Conrad stopped breathing. He remembered drawing it. The great hall of Oakhaven smelled like a slaughterhouse trying to masquerade as a brothel. Pine branches had been thrown onto the massive hearths to mask the underlying scent of wet fur, old blood, and damp stone. But the heavy perfumes worn by the visiting nobility only made the air thick and cloying. Conrad sat on a high-backed chair carved from ironwood, a seat too hard to be comfortable, which suited him fine. Comfort made a man slow. He leaned his jaw against his closed fist. His knuckles were permanently scarred, the skin thick and pale from years of breaking bone and taking steel. Before him stretched the bride toll, a parade of desperate alliances. The lesser lords of the southern territories had come to pay their respects to the Alpha King, and their currency of choice was their daughters. A girl from the Riverlands was kneeling currently. Lady Cecily, or perhaps Celia. Conrad didn't care. She was trembling so violently that the gold coins piled in the wooden chest beside her clattered against each other. Behind her stood her father, a fat man sweating through his woolen doublet, eagerly watching the king for a flicker of interest. Conrad's golden eyes dragged over the chest. Gold. He had mountains of it in the deep vaults. It was cold. You couldn't eat it, it wouldn't keep you warm when the winter storms buried the keep, and it certainly didn't stop a silver blade. He looked at the girl. She was pretty with spun sugar hair and skin that had never seen a day of hard labor. If he let the beast beneath his skin surface even a fraction, she would faint. Or scream. He despised the screaming. Very generous, Lord Fry. Gideon Conrad, second in command, droned from his position beside the dais. Gideon was a towering slab of muscle and old scars, his voice devoid of any inflection. The king accepts your tribute. Join the tables. The fat lord bowed so low, his nose nearly grazed the flagstones. He hauled his daughter up and dragged her away, looking thoroughly relieved to have survived the interaction. Conrad exhaled a low, rumbling sound that originated deep in his chest. "How many more?" he murmured, not moving his jaw. "3, my liege," Gideon replied. "Let them step forward together. Let's be done with it." Gideon signaled the guards at the heavy oak doors. The remaining line shuffled forward. The first 2 were standard fare, a girl draped in shimmering Corthian silk carrying a polished ivory horn, another flanked by twin guards carrying a tapestry woven with silver thread depicting a romanticized, sanitized version of a wolf hunt. Then came the third. Conrad's eyes bypassed the silk and the silver and snagged on her. She didn't belong in this procession. She wore a dress of dark, heavy wool, dyed a practical grey. It was clean, but the hem was frayed, and the elbows had been meticulously patched. She possessed no servants, no chest of wealth, no nervous father eager to trade her for a border dispute settlement. She walked with a measured, deliberate gait. She wasn't trembling. Conrad sat up slightly, the leather of his armor creaking. The beast in him, usually bored to the point of lethargy during these courtly affairs, cracked open an eye. She smelled different, not of fear or floral oils. She smelled like old paper dust and rain. The 3 women stopped at the base of the dais. The first 2 knelt immediately, offering their finery with shaking hands. The woman in grey did not kneel. She simply stood, her hands resting calmly at her sides. She wasn't remarkably beautiful by court standards. Her hair was a dark, unremarkable brown, pulled back in a severe braid. Her face was sharp, pale, and guarded. Gideon frowned, his hand drifting toward the hilt of his broadsword. "You are in the presence of the Alpha King. Kneel and present your tribute." She looked at Gideon, then shifted her gaze up to Conrad. Her eyes were an icy pale blue. They held no awe, only a grim, pragmatic calculation. "I am Beatrice, daughter of Elias," she said. Her voice was steady, carrying clearly through the sudden hush of the hall. "I have no gold, your grace. I have no silk. Those are things a king can buy." The quiet in the room thickened into something suffocating. The lords at the feasting tables stopped eating. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. To come before the beast of Oakhaven empty-handed was suicide. Conrad leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs. He let the heavy silence stretch, testing her nerve. She didn't break eye contact. "Then what do you have, daughter of Elias?" Conrad asked, his voice a gravelly scrape that made the silk-draped girl beside Beatrice flinch. Beatrice reached into the deep pocket of her wool skirt. Several guards stepped forward, boots loud on the stone weapons drawn halfway from their sheaths. Conrad raised a single finger. They froze. Her hand emerged holding something entirely unremarkable. A piece of parchment. It was folded, yellowed at the edges, brittle with age. She took 2 steps forward, ignoring the frantic warning hiss of the lord to her left, and laid the paper on the edge of the bottom step of the dais. She stepped back. Conrad stared at the folded paper. It looked like trash. Debris swept from the corner of a forgotten library. Yet the way she had placed it down like she was handling a loaded crossbow made his skin prickle. He stood. He was a massive man, built for violence, draped in black furs and heavy leather. He descended the 3 stone steps slowly. He picked up the paper. It felt fragile, powdery. He unfolded it. The great hall vanished. The smell of the crowd faded. For a second, Conrad was 10 years old again. He was hiding in the dusty alcove of the western tower, trying to escape the heavy, drunken fists of his father. He remembered the piece of charcoal he had stolen from the kitchens. He remembered smudging his fingers black, desperately trying to sketch something that felt safe. The drawing was crude. Just a heavy-handed blackened stick figure of a boy with a sword, and beside him an impossibly large wolf. But the wolf wasn't baring its teeth. It was curled around the boy. A shield. It was the drawing he had made the night before his first shift. The night before the curse tore his humanity to shreds and remade him into a monster. He had left it in a book. He hadn't seen it in 20 years. Conrad's breathing hitched. The muscles in his jaw corded. He stared at the smudged charcoal lines until they blurred, feeling a violent, agonizing twist in his chest. It was a phantom pain from a ghost he thought he had strangled a lifetime ago. He looked up. Beatrice was still watching him. She wasn't smiling. She looked like a woman who had just thrown her last pair of dice onto the table and was waiting to see if she kept her hands. Conrad crumpled the drawing into his fist. The sound of the brittle paper crushing echoed loudly. "Clear the hall," Conrad commanded. Gideon hesitated. "Sire, the feast. Clear the fucking hall." Conrad roared, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling, vibrating with the unmistakable, resonant timbre of the wolf. Panic erupted. Chairs scraped violently against stone. Men tripped over their own boots in their haste to reach the heavy oak doors, dragging their crying daughters with them. The guards shoved the lingering nobility out, their shouts mingling with the frantic rustle of silk and velvet. In under a minute, the vast, draughty room was empty. Save for Gideon standing entirely still near the dais, and Beatrice, who hadn't moved an inch from her spot, Conrad walked slowly down the remaining steps until he was standing directly in front of her. He towered over her, casting a long, dark shadow. He leaned in, letting her smell the raw, predatory danger rolling off him in waves. "Who are you?" He whispered, his voice dangerously soft. Beatrice looked up at him. She swallowed hard, the first sign of fear she had shown, but her voice didn't shake. "I told you. I am Beatrice. My father was Elias, the head archivist to your father." "Elias is dead," Conrad stated. He remembered the frail old man. He had died in the purge during the bloody coup when Conrad took the throne from his rotting sire. He is. He died in the fire in the lower libraries, Beatrice said flatly. But before he died, he smuggled out 3 crates of ledgers and books. He hid them in our cellar in the village. He said history shouldn't burn just because kings change. Conrad opened his fist slightly, looking at the crushed edges of the parchment. And you went digging through a dead man's stolen books. We starved this winter, Your Grace. Beatrice replied, blunt truth cutting through the thick air. The river froze early. The grain rotted. When the decree came that the lords were bringing tribute to buy your favor, I knew the village had nothing. No gold, no silk. She glanced at his fist. So I brought the only thing I had that belonged to you. Why? Conrad asked, his eyes narrowing. Did you think a scrap of trash would buy you a place at my table? Did you think I would weep and make you a queen out of gratitude? No! Beatrice said, a faint, bitter smile touching her lips. I'm not an idiot, and this isn't a ballad. I thought you would be bored. I thought gold means nothing to a man who owns the mountain it's mined from. I thought... She hesitated, her eyes flickering over his scarred face. I thought you might need to be reminded that you were a boy before you were a beast. Conrad froze. The audacity of the statement should have bought her a quick death. Gideon took a heavy step forward, his sword sliding free with a sharp metallic ring. Hold, Conrad commanded, not looking away from Beatrice. He studied her, the patched elbows, the severe braid, the absolute lack of pretense. She was a survivor. She had played a psychological game with an apex predator, betting her life on the assumption that underneath the violence there was a buried nerve she could strike. She had struck it. It bled invisible, agonizing blood. You are a very dangerous creature, Beatrice, Conrad murmured. He turned his back on her, walking toward the hearth, staring into the roaring flames. The heat baked his face, but he felt cold. Take her to the northern wing, Conrad ordered, addressing Gideon. Beatrice's breath hitched. The northern wing wasn't the dungeons, it was the private quarters. As a prisoner, sire? Gideon asked, his confusion evident. As a guest, Conrad said, turning his head slightly to look at her over his shoulder. The golden hue in his eyes was vivid, piercing in the dim light. For now, she bought my curiosity. Let's see if she can afford to keep it. The northern wing of Oakhaven was quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary, but the tense, heavy silence of a loaded trap. Beatrice sat on the edge of a massive 4-poster bed. The mattress was stuffed with goose down the heavy blankets woven from fine, dyed wool. A fire cracked merrily in the stone grate, throwing long, dancing shadows across the tapestries that lined the walls. It was the most luxurious room she had ever seen. It felt like a tomb. She rubbed her cold hands together, staring at the flames. She was still wearing her patched grey dress. A servant had come earlier to offer her a bath and silks, but Beatrice had refused. Taking their clothes felt like conceding defeat. It felt like accepting the collar. Her heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She had survived the Great Hall. She hadn't been torn apart. But she wasn't foolish enough to think she was safe. A king's curiosity was a fickle, dangerous thing. The heavy iron handle of the oak door clicked. Beatrice stiffened, standing up immediately. Conrad walked in. He had discarded the heavy furs and leathers of the court. He wore simple black trousers, and a loose linen shirt untucked, the laces at his collar undone. Without the armor, he didn't look any less intimidating. He looked wider, thicker. The scars mapping his forearms and the base of his neck were starkly visible in the firelight. He didn't announce himself. He shut the door with a quiet click and leaned against it, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He just looked at her. Beatrice met his gaze, refusing to drop her chin. "Have you come to finish the execution in private, Your Grace?" Conrad snorted a harsh, humorless sound. He walked toward a small wooden table near the window, and poured himself a goblet of dark wine from a silver pitcher. He didn't offer her any. "If I wanted you dead, you'd be a stain on the flagstones in the hall," he said, taking a long drink. He walked toward the fire, the heat illuminating the sharp angles of his face. "Sit down. You make my neck ache, standing so stiff." Beatrice slowly lowered herself back to the edge of the bed. She kept her posture rigid. Conrad reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled charcoal drawing. He didn't smooth it out. He just held the ruined ball of paper in his palm, staring at it. "My father!" Conrad began, his voice low, scraping against the quiet of the room. "Used to lock me in the kennels when I displeased him. Which was often. He said I needed to learn how to live with animals before I became one." Beatrice didn't speak. She knew the stories. Everyone in the north knew the stories of the mad king, the man Conrad had slaughtered to take the crown. "I drew this the day he told me my mother was gone." Conrad continued, his thumb tracing the jagged edge of the paper. "He told me she had run away. It wasn't until years later I found out he had her throat cut for trying to smuggle me out of the keep." He looked up, his golden eyes locking onto hers. The raw, unshielded pain in them made Beatrice's breath catch. It wasn't a look a king gave a peasant. It was the look of a bleeding animal. "Where did you find it?" He demanded, his tone suddenly shifting from reflective to sharp demanding. "In a ledger detailing the grain yields of the western fields from 20 years ago?" Beatrice answered evenly. "It was tucked between the pages of November. And you recognized it." "I recognize the paper." She corrected. "It's vellum from the royal study. My father taught me to identify parchment grades. When I opened it and saw the drawing, I knew it wasn't a ledger entry. You could have sold it to a rival house," Conrad said, stepping closer. He stopped just a few feet from her. "There are lords who would pay well for a piece of the Alpha King's childhood weakness. Proof that the monster used to draw stick figures." "It's not weakness." Beatrice shot back faster than she intended. Conrad's eyebrows raised fractionally. "No, no," she insisted, her voice firming. She looked at the crumpled paper in his hand. "A monster doesn't draw a shield to protect himself. A monster draws teeth. You drew a protector because you didn't want to be the thing that hurt people. You wanted to be safe." The silence that followed was suffocating. Conrad stared at her, his expression unreadable. The muscle in his jaw ticked violently. For a terrifying second, Beatrice thought she had gone too far. She had analyzed the mind of an apex predator to his face. Suddenly, Conrad closed the distance between them. He loomed over her, planting one large hand on the mattress beside her hip, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. She could smell the wine on his breath, mixed with the sharp scent of ozone and pine. "You speak very boldly for a woman who has nothing," he whispered, his voice vibrating in his chest. "I speak boldly because I have nothing to lose," Beatrice replied, refusing to lean back. She looked directly into his golden eyes. "You can kill me. You can throw me in the dungeon, but you can't unhear the truth. You aren't just a wolf, Conrad. You're a man who survived." He flinched. It was microscopic, but she saw it. He pulled back as if she had burned him, turning away and pacing toward the window. He ran a hand through his dark, messy hair. "You don't know what I am," he muttered, looking out at the dark courtyard below. "I know what you choose to show them." Beatrice said, her voice softer now. "You show them the beast because the beast keeps them in line. The beast keeps the daggers out of your back. But the beast didn't draw that picture." Conrad turned back to her. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He looked older than his years. He looked like a man who had been carrying a mountain on his back for decades. "Keep her in the northern wing," he repeated softly to himself, mocking his own earlier order. He looked at Beatrice. "You're a clever girl, daughter of Elias. But clever girls don't last long in Oakhaven. They tend to see too much." "I only see what's there." Beatrice said. Conrad tossed the crumpled ball of paper onto the small table. He walked towards the door. He didn't look back as he opened it. "Lock the door behind me," he said roughly. "The keep is full of lords who are angry their daughters were rejected. They will be looking for the woman who insulted them." He stepped out into the corridor. "And Beatrice." "Yes, Your Grace. Get some sleep. The real games begin tomorrow." The door clicked shut. Beatrice let out a long, shaky breath, her shoulders sagging. She walked over to the door and threw the heavy iron bolt. She turned back to the room, her eyes falling on the small table. She walked over, picked up the crumpled ball of paper, and carefully, meticulously smoothed it back out. Morning in Oakhaven did not break. It bled through the grey sky like a slow bruise. Beatrice stood by the narrow slit of her window, a heavy wool shawl wrapped tightly over her patched dress. Below the courtyard was a hive of aggressive activity. The lords who had brought their daughters were preparing to leave. Wagons were being hitched to massive draft horses. Chests of rejected gold were being loaded with violent, echoing clatters, and the air rang with the sharp curses of men nursing wounded pride. She watched them go with a detached sense of relief. She had survived the night. A sharp knock at her door pulled her away from the cold glass. She unbolted it to find Gideon standing there. The towering second-in-command looked as immovable and severe as the stone walls themselves. He held a bundle of folded cloth in his massive hands. "The king requests your presence in the lower bailey." Gideon stated his voice a low rumble. He thrust the bundle toward her. "Put these on. It's snowing." Beatrice took the clothes. They were thick, practical riding leathers lined with rabbit fur accompanied by a heavy woolen cloak, a far cry from the delicate silks the other women had worn. She nodded her thanks, shut the door, and changed quickly. The leathers fit surprisingly well, pulling snug across her shoulders and hips, offering a sturdy warmth she hadn't felt in years. When she emerged, Gideon didn't offer a word, merely turned and led the way down the spiraling stone staircases. The lower bailey was chaotic. Men-at-arms sparred in the mud, the sharp crack of wooden practice swords ringing out over the barking of massive wolfhounds. The smell of wood smoke and wet earth was pungent. Conrad was standing near the stables. He was dressed for the cold, a heavy grey cloak fastened with an iron wolf's head clasp, draped over his broad shoulders. He was inspecting the hooves of a massive black destrier. As Beatrice approached, he patted the horse's thick neck and turned to face her. He looked her up and down, taking in the leathers. "They fit." "They do. Thank you," Beatrice said, keeping her tone neutral. "You requested me, Your Grace." "Conrad," he corrected abruptly. Beatrice blinked, caught off guard. "Pardon. If you're going to psychoanalyze me and dig through my childhood trauma, you can use my name," he said, his tone dry, bordering on cynical. "Gideon, leave us." Gideon bowed his head slightly and melted into the crowd of soldiers, though Beatrice noticed he didn't go far enough to completely lose sight of them. Conrad gestured for her to walk with him. They moved away from the main activity, heading toward the outer wall, where the sheer cliff dropped off into the roaring river below. "The lords are leaving," Conrad noted, leaning his forearms against the cold stone battlements, looking out over the frosted pine forests. "I saw," Beatrice replied, standing beside him. She kept a respectful distance. Lord Fry looked like he wanted to spit on my boots. Conrad mused, a dark, fleeting smile crossing his face. "He offered me his only daughter, and a third of his treasury, and I kept a commoner with a dirty piece of paper. It insults their understanding of the world." "The world runs on transactions," Beatrice said pragmatically. "They offered you commodities. They don't understand why you rejected them." Conrad turned his head, his golden eyes fixing on her. The wind whipped his dark hair around his face. "And what did you offer me, Beatrice, if not a transaction?" Beatrice looked out at the tree line. The wind was biting, stinging her cheeks. "I offered you a mirror. They wanted to buy a king. I just wanted you to see yourself." Conrad was quiet for a long moment. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a leather flask, unscrewed the top, and took a pull. He offered it to her. Beatrice hesitated, then took it. The liquor inside was fire-raw, unaged spirits that burned down her throat and hit her stomach like a hot coal. She coughed, handing it back. Conrad's lips twitched upward. An actual, genuine sign of amusement. It softened the harsh lines of his face, making him look less like a monument to violence and more like a man. "You have no fear," he said, taking the flask. "I have plenty of fear," Beatrice corrected, wiping her mouth with the back of her leather-clad hand. "I just don't have the luxury of letting it control me. Fear doesn't put food on the table, and it doesn't keep you warm when the roof leaks." Pragmatic. Desperate. Conrad leaned back against the stone, looking at her with a renewed intensity. "You said you brought the drawing because you thought I needed to be reminded I was a boy before I was a beast. Do you really believe the boy is still there?" It was a loaded question. Beatrice could sense the trap, the inherent danger of giving the wrong answer to a man who lived his life on the edge of a violent shift. "I believe—" She started slowly, choosing her words with care. "That trauma doesn't erase who we are. It just buries it under a lot of armor. The beast isn't a disease you caught, Conrad. It's armor you built because the boy wasn't strong enough to survive your father." Conrad's breath caught visibly in the cold air. His grip on the stone wall tightened until his knuckles went white. For a second, the air around him seemed to hum with static, the raw energy of the wolf pressing against the surface of his skin. He stared at her, his jaw locked tight. "You speak of things you do not understand." "Maybe," Beatrice conceded. "But I understand survival. I survived famine, I survived the winter, and I survived standing in front of you. We use what we have too." Conrad looked away, staring down at the raging river far below. The tension in his broad shoulders slowly uncoiled, leaving a heavy, grounded exhaustion in its wake. "They expect me to take a mate," he said suddenly, changing the subject with a jarring pivot. "The council, Gideon, the pack. A king without an heir is a target. They wanted me to choose one of those perfumed girls yesterday." Beatrice didn't react. "And why didn't you—" "Because a wolf cannot mate with a sheep without eventually tearing its throat out," Conrad said, the cynicism thick and bitter in his voice. "They fear me. Even as they offer themselves, they smell of terror. They look at me and see a crown, but they smell the blood on my teeth. I won't have a wife who flinches when I walk into a room." He turned back to her. The golden light in his eyes was steady now, pinning her to the spot. "You didn't flinch." Beatrice's heart gave a slow, heavy thud. She met his gaze, her breath pluming in the cold air between them. "I've seen butchers slaughter pigs, Conrad. I've seen men freeze to death in the streets. I know what the world is. You're a predator, yes, but you're honest about it. I prefer a monster who shows me his teeth over a lord who hides his knife behind a smile." Conrad stepped closer. The wind seemed to die down, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the distant clash of wooden swords. He reached out his large, calloused hand, hovering for a second, before he gently brushed a stray lock of brown hair away from her face, tucking it behind her ear. His fingers were startlingly warm against her cold skin. "You're staying," he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a decree spoken with the absolute authority of the Alpha, but underlaid with a strange, hesitant plea. "I don't have anywhere else to go," Beatrice admitted softly. Conrad dropped his hand. "Good. We have a council meeting at noon. You will attend." Beatrice's eyes widened slightly. "A council meeting, I'm a villager. The lords will riot. Let them—" Conrad said, a dark, dangerous smile returning to his face. "I am the king, and I think it's time my council learned to appreciate the value of an honest, cynical voice. Come along, Beatrice. The wolves are hungry, and it's time to feed them." He turned and strode back toward the keep, his black cloak billowing behind him. Beatrice stood frozen for a moment, the heat of his brief touch still burning on her cheek. She looked out at the freezing river one last time, taking a deep breath of the sharp air. She had bet her life on a piece of paper. It seemed she had won a seat at the table. Now she just had to survive the meal. She pulled her heavy cloak tighter and followed the wolf back into the den. The war room was buried deep in the heart of the keep, insulated by 10 feet of solid granite. It smelled heavily of tallow candles, stale ale, and wet wool. When Conrad pushed the heavy doors open, the low hum of conversation died instantly. 7 men sat around a massive circular table, hewn from a single oak slab. These were not the perfumed, soft-handed lords of the southern territories. These were the alphas of the northern packs. They wore thick furs, their beards were braided with iron beads, and their eyes carried the feral, unblinking stillness of predators. Beatrice stepped into the room behind Conrad. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate and violent. The men did not stand. They didn't bow. They stared at her with a collective, calculating hostility that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She kept her chin level. She folded her hands in front of her, digging her fingernails into her own palms to stop them from shaking. Conrad walked to the head of the table. He didn't sit. He slammed both hands flat against the wood. The loud crack made a few of the younger men flinch. "Report!" Conrad barked. Lord Holden, a man whose face was a ruin of old claw marks, leaned back in his chair. He didn't look at Conrad. He kept his cold, pale eyes fixed squarely on Beatrice. "We were prepared to report on the winter grain rations, Your Grace." Holden rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "But it seems you brought a stray into the den. Is she meant to serve the ale?" The table erupted in low, mocking chuckles. Gideon, standing by the door, crossed his massive arms. Conrad didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "She is Beatrice. She stays. Speak on the grain, Holden, or I will find someone else to manage the western stores." Holden's jaw tightened. He finally dragged his eyes away from Beatrice to look at his king. "The western stores are failing. The frost came 3 weeks early. The soil is dead. We are requesting a diversion of the southern tribute funds to buy imported rye from the coast, else my people starve before the thaw." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Beatrice frowned. She looked at the scattered parchment maps on the table, then up at Holden. The arithmetic in her head clicked into place, cold and sharp. She had spent the last 5 years starving in a village, poring over her dead father's stolen ledgers by candlelight, just to keep her mind sharp. Before she could stop herself, the words left her mouth. "That's a lie." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that preceded a slaughter. Holden slowly stood up. He was massive, built like a boulder. "What did you say, girl?" "I said it's a lie," Beatrice repeated. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her voice was flat. She stepped out from behind Conrad's shadow, moving closer to the table. "I read the Western harvest ledgers from the last 10 years. The soil isn't dead. You shifted crop rotations 3 years ago to plant flax instead of wheat, because linen sells for a higher coin in the eastern markets. You aren't starving. You're hoarding cash crops while your people eat bark. And now you want the king's tribute money to cover the deficit of your own greed." Holden's face flushed a dark, mottled purple. A low, vibrating growl started in his chest. "You insolent little bitch! I will tear out your tongue." He lunged across the table. He never made it. Conrad moved faster than a human eye could track. 1 second he was standing at the head of the table. The next he had Holden by the throat. Conrad slammed the massive lord face first into the oak wood with bone-shattering force. Wood splintered. Maps tore. The heavy table groaned under the impact. The other alphas shot to their feet, their chairs crashing backward onto the stone floor. Their eyes flashed gold, teeth elongated. The air became thick, oppressive, charged with the sudden metallic tang of adrenaline and dominance. Gideon drew his broadsword. The scrape of steel echoed loudly. Conrad didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need one. He leaned over Holden, his hand still clamped like an iron vice around the back of the older man's neck. Conrad's own eyes were burning a terrifying, luminous amber in the dim candlelight. "Sit down," Conrad whispered. It wasn't a request. It was an alpha command laced with the crushing psychic weight of the king's bloodline. Beatrice felt the pressure of it physically, a heavy, invisible hand forcing her shoulders down, stealing her breath. The other lords fought it for a fraction of a second. Then one by one they averted their eyes, their shoulders slumping. They righted their chairs and sat. Conrad looked down at Holden, whose nose was bleeding sluggishly onto the map of the Western Territories. "She called you a liar, Holden. She did not give you permission to touch her," Conrad said softly. He released his grip and stepped back, wiping a smear of blood from his thumb onto his trousers. "Now, is she right?" Holden pushed himself up, breathing heavily. He wiped his bloody face, his eyes darting from Conrad to Beatrice. The feral rage was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. The flax yields were higher than anticipated. Holden muttered to the table, humiliated. "You will sell the flax," Conrad ordered, his voice returning to its normal gravelly cadence. "You will use the coin to buy the rye. If I hear of one villager in the west starving this winter, I will hang you from the battlements by your own entrails. Are we clear?" "Yes, your grace." Conrad turned his back on the lords and looked at Beatrice. He didn't smile, but there was a fierce, burning approval in his eyes. "Meeting dismissed," Conrad said. The lords scrambled to leave. They didn't look at Beatrice on their way out. When the heavy doors finally clicked shut, leaving only Conrad, Gideon, and Beatrice in the room, Beatrice finally let out the breath she felt like she'd been holding for 10 minutes. Her knees suddenly felt like water. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. Conrad watched her. "You have a terrible habit of courting death, Beatrice. He was trying to rob you," she said, her voice shaking slightly now that the danger had passed. "I hate thieves, especially fat ones who let their own people go hungry." Conrad walked over to her. He reached out and gently unpried her white-knuckled fingers from the edge of the table. "You knew the ledgers." "My father's books. I had nothing else to read." Conrad looked down at her hands. They were calloused, the nails clipped short and blunt. "They look at you and see prey. You just showed them you're a trap." He looked up, his golden eyes locking onto hers. "Do not do it again without my permission. Next time I might let him bite you just to teach you a lesson." "No, you wouldn't," Beatrice said softly. Conrad's jaw ticked. He dropped her hands. "Gideon, take her to the lower archives. Let her see the mess her father left behind." The lower archives smelled like forgotten time. It was a cavernous subterranean room located beneath the old chapel. Water dripped steadily in a far corner, a metronome ticking away in the darkness. The shelves stretched high into the vaulted ceiling, crammed with rotting scrolls, mouldering leather-bound books, and stacks of loose parchment covered in a thick grey blanket of dust. Beatrice stood in the center of the room, holding a single oil lamp. She felt a profound, aching sadness. This was where her father had spent his life. This was the history of Oakhaven left to rot by a king who only cared for the future. She rolled up the sleeves of her riding leathers, tied her hair back tighter, and got to work. For 3 days she lived in the dust. She hauled warped, water-damaged volumes out into the stone corridors to dry. She categorized trade agreements, birth records, and the dark, bloody histories of the Pack Wars. She sneezed until her ribs ached, her hands permanently stained black with old ink and grime. On the 4th night, it was late. The castle above was silent. Beatrice was sitting on the cold stone floor, surrounded by a semicircle of sorted ledgers, trying to decipher the faded script of a 50-year-old treaty. The heavy iron door creaked open. Beatrice didn't look up. "Gideon, if that's the mutton stew again, I'm going to throw it at your head. I asked for bread and cheese." "I am entirely out of bread," a deep, rough voice replied. Beatrice's head snapped up. Conrad stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his armor or his cloak. He wore a simple unbleached linen shirt and dark trousers. He looked exhausted. The shadows under his eyes were bruised and heavy. He held a wooden tray carrying a block of sharp white cheese, half a loaf of dark bread, and 2 cups of wine. He walked in ignoring the dust, and set the tray down on a relatively clean patch of stone near her. He sank to the floor, crossing his long legs, leaning his back against a towering wooden bookshelf. Beatrice wiped her dirty hands on a rag. "You didn't have to bring it yourself, Conrad." "I needed a quiet room," he said, staring blankly at the far wall. "The keep is too loud tonight. I can hear their hearts beating. I can hear them breathing in their sleep." Beatrice paused. She looked at him carefully. The king was slipping. She could see the micro-tremors in his hands, the way his pupils were blown wide, drowning out the amber irises. The wolf was close to the surface, clawing at the inside of his skull. "Full moon?" she asked quietly. "Tomorrow night," he rasped, dragging a hand down his face. "The days before are difficult." Beatrice pulled the tray closer. She broke off a piece of bread and offered it to him. He shook his head. She poured a cup of wine and pushed it into his hand. He took it, his knuckles grazing hers. His skin was burning up. "Does it hurt?" she asked. The shift. The stories in the village claimed the transformation was a glorious, magical thing. A burst of moonlight and a smooth transition from man to beast. Conrad gave a harsh, breathless laugh. He took a slow drink of the wine. "It breaks every bone in my body, Beatrice. My spine snaps in 3 places to elongate. My jaw fractures to make room for the teeth. My skin tears to let the fur through. It takes 4 minutes, and I feel every second of it." Beatrice stared at him. The cold reality of it settled over her like a heavy blanket. He wasn't a magical creature. He was a man trapped in a recurring cycle of agonizing, visceral body horror. "Why don't they ever say that in the songs?" she whispered. "Because the songs are written by men who want to romanticize power," Conrad said bitterly. He set the cup down. "Power is ugly, it's violent, and it demands a toll." He leaned his head back against the wood, closing his eyes. The flickering lamplight caught the jagged scar that ran from just beneath his ear, down the side of his neck, disappearing under his shirt. Beatrice reached out. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a purely human instinct to soothe something that was hurting. Her dust-covered fingers gently brushed against the raised edge of the scar on his neck. Conrad went entirely rigid. His eyes snapped open. They were entirely gold now. No human pupil. Just the terrifying, unblinking stare of the Alpha. A low, vibrating growl ripped through his chest, a sound that made Beatrice's bones rattle. She didn't pull her hand back. She held it steady, resting her palm flat against the hot, scarred skin of his neck. "I'm right here," she said, her voice a calm, even anchor in the dark room. "It's just me. Breathe." For 10 agonizing seconds he stared at her. The beast weighed her, calculating whether she was a threat, whether she was prey. Beatrice kept her breathing slow and steady. She didn't break eye contact. She let him see that she wasn't afraid. Slowly, agonizingly, the gold receded. The human pupil dilated back into existence. The growl faded into a ragged, shuddering exhale. Conrad slumped forward, resting his forehead heavily against her shoulder. He was massive, his weight pushing her back slightly, but she braced herself and took it. He smelled of sweat copper and damp earth. "You shouldn't touch me when I'm like this," he whispered into the crook of her neck, his voice cracking. "I could have torn your arm off before my brain caught up with my teeth." "But you didn't," Beatrice said simply. She slowly brought her other hand up and rested it lightly on his back, feeling the heavy corded muscles coiled tight beneath the linen shirt. "You drew a shield, Conrad. Remember." He let out a long, shaky breath, the tension slowly draining out of him into the cold stone floor. They sat there in the dust and the dark, the king and the archivist's daughter surrounded by the rotting history of a bloody kingdom. For the first time in 20 years, Conrad didn't feel entirely alone. The peace of the archives shattered the following evening. The great hall was packed. It was the eve of the full moon, a night when the pack traditionally gathered to feast, drink, and burn off the aggressive energy that hummed in their blood. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and the sour tang of spilled ale. Beatrice sat at the high table placed deliberately by Gideon, 2 seats down from the king. It was a statement of protection, but it felt like a target painted on her back. She picked at a plate of roasted root vegetables, watching the room with a cynical eye. At the far tables, the younger wolves were getting loud. They were the sons of the Alpha's boys, who had not yet fought a real war, but possessed all the arrogance of apex predators. Among them was Cedric, the eldest son of Lord Holden. Cedric was deep into his 4th horn of mead. He had his father's cruel mouth and a reckless, burning ambition in his eyes. He kept looking toward the high table, his gaze sliding past Conrad to lock onto Beatrice. "He's going to do something stupid," Beatrice murmured, taking a sip of water. Conrad, sitting to her left, didn't look up from his meat. He was holding a heavy silver knife, cutting his food with precise mechanical motions. Let him. An hour passed. The noise escalated into a dull roar. Then the inevitable happened. Cedric stood up. He kicked his heavy wooden chair back. It clattered loudly onto the flagstones. The men around him quieted, sensing the shift in the air. Cedric grabbed a heavy iron tankard and walked unsteadily towards the dais. Gideon stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "Stand down, Gideon," Conrad ordered quietly, finally looking up. Cedric stopped at the base of the steps. He looked up at Conrad, a drunken, insolent sneer twisting his face. "My king." Cedric slurred loudly, projecting his voice so the hall could hear. "We celebrate the eve of the moon. We celebrate the strength of the pack. Yet you keep a human pet at your table? A frail, scentless thing." He pointed a thick finger at Beatrice. "My father says she talks out of turn. I say she smells like a weak link in the chain." Beatrice didn't blink. She looked at Cedric with the same detached, calculating stare she gave the ruined ledgers in the basement. "And you smell like fermented honey and bad decisions, boy." A few of the older warriors barked out rough laughs. Cedric flushed a deep, ugly red. "You don't speak to me, whore," Cedric snarled. His eyes flashed gold. He took a step up the dais. The air in the room vanished. Conrad didn't stand up. He simply moved. He vaulted the heavy oak table with terrifying grace, clearing the plates and goblets in a blur of black cloth and muscle. He landed on the steps directly in front of Cedric. Cedric swung the heavy iron tankard at Conrad's head. Conrad didn't even bother to block it. He ducked the clumsy swing, stepped inside Cedric's guard, and drove his fist into the younger man's sternum. The sickening crunch of breaking bone echoed clearly through the sudden dead silence of the hall. Cedric gasped, his eyes going wide as the air was forcefully ejected from his lungs. Before Cedric could fall, Conrad grabbed him by the throat and hoisted him entirely off the ground. Cedric kicked his legs, clawing frantically at the iron grip, crushing his windpipe. Conrad turned, holding the suffocating boy out toward the crowd. His own face was a mask of cold, controlled violence. "Look at him!" Conrad's voice boomed, carrying easily to the farthest corners of the hall. It wasn't human. It was the deep, resonant snarl of the beast. "Look at the arrogance of a whelp who thinks he understands strength." Lord Holden shot up from his table, his chair falling. "My king, please, he is drunk." "He is weak," Conrad corrected. He looked back at Cedric, whose face was turning a mottled purple. "You think cruelty is power, Cedric. You think insulting a woman who has more courage in her little finger than you have in your entire body makes you an alpha." Conrad leaned in close. "It just makes you a target." Conrad opened his hand. Cedric dropped to the stone floor like a sack of grain, coughing violently, dragging ragged, wheezing breaths into his bruised lungs. He scrambled backward, terrified, pressing himself against the base of the nearest pillar. Conrad stood over him for a moment, breathing heavily. The gold in his eyes was blindingly bright. He looked around the room, daring any other man to stand up. Nobody moved. The pack submitted to the sheer, crushing weight of his dominance. Conrad turned his back on them and walked slowly up the steps of the dais. As he reached the table, Beatrice saw it. His hands were shaking. Not with fear, but with the massive, adrenaline-fueled effort it took to keep the wolf inside. The violence had called to the surface, and it didn't want to go back to sleep. He looked at her, his jaw locked tight, his chest heaving. He looked terrifying. He looked like a monster. Beatrice stood up. Gideon took a half-step toward her, a silent warning. She ignored him. She walked around the edge of the table and stopped in front of Conrad. She didn't look at the crowd. She only looked at him. She reached out and wrapped both of her hands around his large, trembling fist. His knuckles were bruised from the impact against Cedric's chest. "You made your point," she said softly, her voice pitched so only he could hear. "Now put the teeth away." Conrad stared down at her hands. Her grip was firm grounding. The cold logic of her touch cut through the hot, blinding haze of the predator's instinct. He squeezed his eyes shut. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. When he opened his eyes, they were human again. The terrifying gold was gone, replaced by the tired, amber hue she was beginning to recognize. "Come," Conrad said, his voice raw. He turned his hand, lacing his thick fingers through hers. "I am tired of this room." He pulled her gently but firmly away from the table, leading her towards the private doors at the back of the dais. The great hall watched in stunned silence as the Alpha King of the North walked away from a fight, hand in hand with a woman who wore patched wool and smelled of dust. As the heavy doors closed behind them, Beatrice realized the truth. She hadn't just survived the wolf. She was the one holding his leash. The full moon did not rise with grace. It dragged itself over the jagged peaks of the northern mountains, a bloated, pale eye staring down at Oakhaven. Conrad did not stay in the northern wing. As the twilight deepened into a bruised purple, he walked down into the lowest levels of the keep, far below the archives, to a reinforced stone cell built by his mad father. The door was solid iron, 4 inches thick, barred from the outside. Beatrice followed him. He didn't ask her to, and he didn't tell her to go back. Gideon was already waiting by the cell. The giant man held a heavy iron key and looked deeply unhappy to see Beatrice standing in the damp, torch-lit corridor. "You shouldn't be down here," Gideon said, his voice flat. "I've seen butcher's work, Gideon. I won't faint." Beatrice replied, pulling her shawl tighter against the creeping chill. Conrad stripped off his shirt. In the harsh orange light of the torches, the web of scars across his back looked like a map of a violent, unforgiving country. He didn't look at her. His muscles were already spasming, his breathing coming in short, ragged hitches. "Lock it," Conrad ordered, stepping into the dark cell. "Don't open it until the sun touches the courtyard flagstones." Gideon swung the heavy iron door shut. The deadbolts slid into place with a series of loud, final clanks. Then the screaming started. Beatrice flinched. She had expected a roar. She had expected the guttural sound of a beast. She had not expected the high, tearing scream of a human man in unspeakable agony. It echoed off the damp stone, vibrating in her teeth. Then came the wet, sickening crunch of bones, snapping, reshaping themselves against their will. It went on for 4 minutes, exactly as he had told her. 4 minutes of pure, unadulterated torture, ending in a massive, heavy thud against the inside of the iron door, followed by a low, hollow panting. Gideon leaned against the wall, staring at the ceiling. Every month, for 20 years, Beatrice didn't reply. She walked over to the iron door and slowly slid down it, sitting on the cold, filthy floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. Through the thick metal she could hear the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a massive predator. It paced. Claws clicked against the stone. She leaned her head back against the iron. I'm still here," she said quietly. The pacing stopped. A heavy weight pressed against the other side of the door right behind her head. A long, shuddering exhale puffed out from the small iron grate near the floor. Beatrice closed her eyes and prepared to wait out the long night. When dawn broke, the corridor was freezing. Gideon unbolted the door. Beatrice stood, her muscles stiff and aching. The cell smelled of hot copper sweat and animal musk. Conrad was lying face down on the stone floor, entirely naked, his chest heaving. He was covered in sweat and old blood from where his skin had split to accommodate the shift. He was human again, but barely. He looked broken. Gideon stepped back. Beatrice stepped in. She held a thick woolen blanket she had brought down from her room. She knelt beside him, the stone biting into her knees. She draped the heavy wool over his shivering shoulders. Conrad groaned a rough scraping sound. He slowly pushed himself up on his elbows, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked over his shoulder at her. His eyes were entirely human, bloodshot and exhausted. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice ravaged. "I told you," Beatrice said, smoothing the blanket over his scarred back. "I don't run from the things I understand." The king was weak. The moon took a physical toll that required 2 days of deep, uninterrupted rest to repay. The castle knew this. Lord Holden knew this. Beatrice was in the lower archives the next afternoon. She was alone, searching for a specific volume detailing the Western aqueduct systems. The air was thick with dust motes dancing in the slanted shafts of afternoon light, piercing the high, narrow windows. She heard the heavy thud of boots on stone. Not 1 pair. 4. She didn't turn around immediately. She carefully slid a heavy leather-bound ledger back into its slot on the shelf. "You shouldn't be reading in the dark, girl. It ruins the eyes." Lord Holden stood at the end of the aisle. 3 of his personal guards fanned out behind him, their hands resting casually on the hilts of their short swords. Holden's nose was bruised black and purple from where Conrad had smashed his face into the table. He looked angry. He looked hungry for a kill. Beatrice turned slowly. She wiped the dust from her hands onto her skirt. "The king is resting, Lord Holden. If you need an audience, you will have to wait for tomorrow." Holden sneered. "I don't need the king. I came to solve a pest problem. You made a fool of me in the war room. You whispered your lies into his ear. You made him attack a loyal alpha." "I read a ledger," Beatrice corrected flatly. "You made yourself a fool." Holden took a step forward. "He is asleep. Gideon is guarding his door. The lower archives are a dangerous place. The foundations are old. Shelves collapse. Fires start. Tragic accidents happen to curious little girls who dig where they shouldn't." Beatrice looked at the 3 guards. They were blocking the only exit. She was unarmed. She wore no armor. She was entirely trapped. She smiled. It was a small, cold thing that didn't reach her eyes. "You think because I read books I don't know how to fight?" Beatrice said, her voice echoing softly in the cavernous room. "I think you are a peasant in patched wool who overplayed her hand." Holden spat, drawing his dagger. "I spent 5 years reading the architectural blueprints of this keep, Holden," Beatrice said, taking a slow step backward toward the massive stone wall. "My father meticulously mapped the old construction. Do you know what sits directly beneath the floor you are standing on?" Holden paused, his eyes narrowing. "What are you babbling about?" "The old drainage reservoir," Beatrice stated. "It was built to flush the slaughterhouse waste into the river. It relies on a counterweight system, iron grating and heavy hinges. They haven't been oiled in a century, but the iron is still thick." She reached behind the final bookshelf. Her hand closed around a thick, rust-flaked iron lever, bolted to the wall, hidden entirely by the shadows and rotting wood. Holden looked down at the stone floor. Realization dawned entirely too late. "Stop her!" Beatrice pulled the lever with all her body weight. The grinding shriek of rusted gears echoed like a dying monster. The floor beneath Holden and his men simply gave way. The massive iron grates swung open downward on a central hinge. The guards screamed as they plummeted into the pitch-black, freezing water 20 feet below. Holden caught the edge of the stone with a desperate, bloody scrape of his hands. His legs dangled over the abyss. Beatrice walked over to the edge. She looked down at Holden. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He scrambled for purchase, but the mossy stone offered none. "Help me up!" He gasped, his fingers slipping. "Pull me up." Beatrice knelt. She didn't reach for him. "You wanted to buy a king with stolen coin," Beatrice said quietly, the echoes of the splashing guards ringing from below. "You wanted to kill me in the dark. I am not a king, Holden. I am not a wolf. I don't need to break your neck to beat you." She watched his fingers slip entirely. Holden screamed as he felt the sound ending in a heavy, echoing splash in the dark reservoir below. Beatrice stood up. She dusted off her skirt, walked to the far wall, and pulled a secondary chain. The iron grates groaned heavily, swinging back up and locking into place with a loud, definitive clang, sealing the treacherous Alpha and his men in the freezing dark. She picked up her oil lamp. She had reading to finish. Gideon found them 2 hours later. The Western Lord was half frozen and entirely broken, confessing to treason through violently chattering teeth before Gideon even needed to draw his sword. Holden was hauled to the dungeons, leaving a trail of freezing water on the cold stone. Conrad summoned Beatrice to the great hall at midnight. The room was empty. The hearths had burned down to glowing embers. Conrad sat on the edge of the high table. The heavy furs were gone. He wore a simple linen shirt sleeves pushed up over his scarred forearms. The exhaustion still shadowed his eyes, but the feral gold had settled into a quiet, human amber. Beatrice walked toward him. Her boots clicked rhythmically against the flagstones. "Gideon tells me you dropped an alpha into the slaughter chute," Conrad said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded profoundly amused. "He was staging an accident," Beatrice replied, stopping a few feet from him. "I simply obliged him." Conrad studied her. The patched grey wool, the severe braid, the utter lack of trembling. "You are a terrifying creature, Beatrice." "I am practical." Conrad stood. He closed the distance between them. He didn't loom. He dropped the heavy posture of the Alpha King and stood before her, simply as a man. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. Not gold, not jewels. It was a square frame carved from dark ironwood. Behind a pane of polished quartz sat the crumpled, smudged charcoal drawing of the boy and the wolf. He had meticulously flattened the brittle edges. He held it out. Beatrice felt her throat tighten. She took at her fingers, briefly brushing the rough calluses of his knuckles. "They brought me tribute to buy a monster," Conrad said softly. "Silk and gold. Women who reeked of terror. You brought me the one piece of my soul I thought was dead." He reached up gently, cupping her jaw. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "I need an anchor," he whispered. "I cannot have a mate who flinches at my shadows. I need the woman who drops my enemies into a sewer and sits with me in the dark." Beatrice looked up into his eyes. She saw the boy. She saw the wolf. She saw the man holding them both together. "Stay," he asked, a raw question, not a command. "I'll stay," Beatrice said firmly, holding the wooden frame against her chest. "But you're buying me new ledgers. The ones in the basement are entirely ruined." Conrad laughed, a deep, chest-rumbling sound that chased the ghosts from the hall and pulled her against him. "Take the kingdom, Beatrice. Just keep me human. Sometimes the most powerful tribute isn't wrapped in silk. It's the brutal courage to look a monster in the eye and see the man beneath. If Beatrice's sharp mind and patched wool rebellion kept you hooked to the very end, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next audio drama. We explore dark, fantasy-grounded romance and unforgiving worlds where survival takes more than just sharp teeth. Drop a comment below What would you have offered the Alpha King to survive the bride toll? See you in the next tale.